I was a student actually here at Oxford 20 years ago, believe it or not, probably before some of you were born, I imagine, which makes me feel incredibly ancient. The question under discussion is it rational to be a Christian? And to some extent, that involves my journey at Oxford along the way. A good place to start, though, would be to define the word rational. A simple definition might be that rational beliefs are those that are supported by good evidence, and that works for me. In some ways, tonight I've taken the burden of proof on myself in the way the question has been worded. Is it rational to be a Christian? We might equally have asked, is it rational to be an atheist? Because at the end of the day, we all need to provide good reasons for what we believe. Nevertheless, I don't think the burden is too heavy on me, because actually I think it's possible to rationally be a Christian or to rationally be an atheist. People often have different but personally valid reasons for believing different things. I'm not going to declare an atheist is irrational necessarily just because they come to a different conclusion to me after looking at the evidence. So I hope that favour might be returned by Stephen tonight, we'll see. Or he might be prepared to say, at the very least, being a Christian is not irrational. And of course, what's really at stake isn't just, is it rational, but is it true? Because when it comes to atheism and Christianity, obviously at least one of them must be false. Today, I'm going to present what I think are objective evidences for the truth of Christianity. But as I say, I think you can rationally be a Christian even without objective evidence. Many people are Christians on the basis of some subjective experience, believing that Christ has in some way entered, shaped, or changed their life. And until they're given some other compelling reason not to trust that experience, I think they're justified in holding to it. And that was me in my late teens. I had an experience of God that meant I called myself a Christian up to the point I came here to Oxford University. But of course, once I got here, I did have that belief challenged when I encountered skeptics among my friends and tutors and peers. In fact, I had quite a significant period of doubt towards the end of my first year when I genuinely questioned whether any of this was true. And it was really then that I started looking into the objective evidence for Christianity. And that continued after university as I began the Unbelievable show. 20 years later, it's left me convinced that actually Christianity is an intellectually compelling account of reality. So I mentioned the burden of proof is on me tonight, but actually it's not always helpful to do things in isolation. I think contrast often brings clarity. So what I've learned in hosting the show is that we all do have a worldview, a way of seeing the world. And I'll be hoping to show tonight that it's more rational to be a Christian than to be an atheist. Specifically, atheist materialism is what I have in view, and I believe is the view Stephen holds, so he'll be able to tell us himself. It's the idea that ultimately all that exists is matter and energy in motion. There's no supernatural dimension to reality. In my opinion, there are lots of aspects of reality that kind of atheist materialism fails to ultimately explain, but which Christianity makes good sense of. Now, time's really short, so I'm going to whiz through a few of them, and I hope I don't trigger too many of Stephen's famous fallacy cards along the way. Firstly, I think God makes sense of human existence. Atheists often claim that science confirms atheism, but I disagree. I think lots of aspects of science point towards God. For instance, the fine-tuning of the universe for life is this extraordinary phenomenon where it seems that when the universe came into being, which is itself a pretty remarkable fact, it was birthed with an amazingly precise set of values that govern the laws of nature, and they have to be just as they are for life to develop at some point in the cosmos. For instance, if the gravitational constant differed from its actual value by 1 part in 10 to the 60, then stars wouldn't be able to form, which produce the specific chemicals needed for life to be possible. And that's just one of many examples, some of them far, far more unlikely. So the fact that we're here, is it just a happy accident, as many atheists claim? Well, the chances seem so extraordinarily minute that the better hypothesis is that we were meant to be here, that there is in fact a designer behind the universe. And even the fact we can do this sort of science is because the universe is written in the language of mathematics. Now, maths is an abstract subject that we can work out in our head, yet for some bizarre reason, it happens that the entire physical universe can be mapped out and predicted using its principles. It's what the Nobel Prize-winning physicist Eugene Wigner described as the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics. Again, is it just a happy coincidence? And again, I think luck isn't a satisfactory explanation here. It makes more sense to believe that there's a mind behind this language of the universe and ultimately behind the language of life who intends for us to be able to be here and to explore the cosmos in which we find ourselves. So I believe God makes sense of human existence. Secondly, I believe God makes sense of human value. Last year was the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I imagine that everyone in this room celebrates the values of equality, dignity, and personhood that it embodies. The question is, why? Why should we treat each other as having these intrinsic value and inviolable rights? I haven't found a good explanation for that on atheist materialism. If we are just one more byproduct of an unguided evolutionary process, why should we deserve special treatment? And if one culture develops a disregard for some human lives, such as parts of the world where baby girls are left to die because there is a preference for boys, well, that's just the way the world is. There's no ultimate right or wrong in the universe. It's ultimately just governed by the blind forces of materialism. Now, the problem here is that a scientific approach, some people try to use that to gain some kind of a moral value system, but it won't buy you a moral universe. Science is really great at describing the way things are, but it has nothing to say about the way things ought to be, and that's what morality is. But we know, don't we, that there are ways that we should treat each other as humans, that some things are objectively right and wrong, regardless of what our evolutionary history or culture happens to have delivered us. So for me, whereas atheism fails to account for this human value, Christianity has a ready explanation. In fact, from page 1 of the Bible, we're told that humans are made in the image of God. And not just that God came in the person of Jesus ultimately to die for us. And that invests humans with ultimate dignity and value. That's why I believe God makes sense of human value. Thirdly, I think God makes sense of human reason. Now, as his YouTube name, Rationality Rules, suggests, Stephen is a committed defender of reason. But atheist materialism fundamentally undermines the very rationality that Stephen says rules. Why? Well, Stephen is an atheist materialist, as I've said, and therefore, quite rightly, a determinist. He believes there's no such thing as free will. We live in a closed system, a universe of purely material cause and effect. What that means is you had no choice of being here. You had no choice in the clothes you're wearing or the millions of large or tiny decisions that you make every day. In the end, it's just about atoms and electrons doing their thing. There's actually not even a you to speak of, just a collection of utterly predetermined processes going on in your brain. Determinism also means that if you're a Christian here tonight, you didn't choose to be. And if you're an atheist, you didn't choose to be. The universe chose it for you. One brain happens to fizz in one way that makes them an atheist, and another brain happens to fizz in another way that makes them a Christian. And in the end, there's nothing true or false about the activity of electrons in our brains. But you might be starting to see the problem now. You see, if we never choose our beliefs, but they're handed to us by a non-rational, determined process, then we haven't actually arrived at them through a process of reasoning. That's why atheistic determinism fundamentally undermines the concept of reason to begin with. That means that Stephen and his fellow atheists have effectively sawn off the branch that they're sitting on. For us to have any confidence in deterministic materialism, we have to believe we've got good reasons for it. But if we had no choice about coming to those beliefs, then we've no reason to say they're good. It's utterly self-defeating. Now, the only way out of this pickle is if there is some kind of guarantor of reason, and I believe God is that guarantor. If there's a God, then we aren't in this closed system. Our sense that we are actually free and that we can use reason to arrive at our beliefs, well, that makes sense if God creates us with genuine freedom to choose. That's why I believe God makes sense of human reason, whereas atheist materialism doesn't. You could even say that God makes the rules of rationality. That one was for you, Steve. Finally, look, I kind of made a case for God here, but what about the Christian one? Is there a way of knowing which God? I think we already have some clues to this along the way, but the point is, it's at this point really that we come to the person of Jesus. If the central claim at the heart of Christian faith is that Jesus died and rose again, well, if that's true, then we have a good reason for believing his claim that he was God. I believe that just as it's rational to believe that there's a God behind the universe, it's also rational to believe that that God raised Jesus from the dead. Why? Well, very briefly, there are good historical reasons to believe what the first followers of Jesus said about him was true. You don't have to accept the Bible as divinely inspired, to be able to appreciate them as historical documents, especially the New Testament. And across the vast majority of New Testament historians, both believing and non-believing, there's a wide consensus on several facts. Here's a few of them. Firstly, that Jesus died by Roman crucifixion. Secondly, that his tomb was discovered empty by a group of his female followers. Third, that his followers had experiences that they believed were of the risen Christ. Fourth, that against the odds, skeptics who were opposed to Christianity were converted, such as Paul and James, the brother of Jesus. And fifth, that the explosive growth of the early Christian church and transformation of defeated followers into a group of people willing to be persecuted and die for their belief in a resurrected Messiah. Well, we've got to ask, where did that come from as well? And despite the various alternative hypotheses that have been given, I think the most reasonable conclusion to draw from these historical facts is the one that the first followers gave, that Jesus had indeed been raised from the dead. There's a resurrection-shaped hole, if you like, at the birth of Christianity. So in my very short time, what I've sketched out here amounts to a cumulative case for Christianity and why I do think it's perfectly rational to be a Christian. Indeed, I'd argue it's more rational to be a Christian than to be an atheist. Of course, as I hinted earlier, faith in God isn't simply an intellectual thing. I believe that Christianity makes sense of us emotionally too, as humans, and perhaps a bit later on, in my final words, I'll have a chance to talk about that. But for now, I hope that's given us something to talk about when we get into our conversation, and I'm looking forward to hearing what Stephen has to say. Thank you.
For more conversations between Christians and skeptics, subscribe to the Unbelievable podcast. And for more updates and bonus content, sign up to the Unbelievable newsletter.